I want us to talk a bit about multiculturalism. And the reason
Yes.
why I want us to talk about it is because it's one of the main isms of late. And I have been excessively critical of about it. But I think that whenever we're talking about abstract concepts, we are very vague, and there always lies there the need for developing a conception of what we mean by when we're using an abstract term. The same is with diversity. So, in circles that we both move, presumably diversity is a word that, when is heard, we're supposed to go boo. But on the other hand, I think the most philosophically apt reaction to this is to basically ask, what do we mean? What is diversity? Diversity of what? And whether it's good or bad. So when it comes to multiculturalism, I think a really good idea is to just sit down from a philosophical perspective and start talking about it. Interrogate multiculturalism. And I want to ask you several questions about it. So, what is multiculturalism? And most probably, we will need to start by asking, what is a culture? Because multiculturalism essentially means many cultures. So, what would you say a culture is?
I take a fairly Wittgensteinian approach, if you will, to these questions, and meaning that I don't take one essential definition, but that basically a family of resemblances, to use his kind of language when we try to define something. Late Wittgenstein, anyway, the as opposed to early Wittgenstein, who, as you know, was rejected by Wittgenstein himself. But anyway, the my understanding of culture, and I think it's important to point out that the people who speak in favor of multiculturalism, they themselves usually have rather a poor understanding of what they mean by it, and it's just sort of a general feeling that they have of what a society should look like, but they haven't crystallized it very clearly in their minds. Most of them, anyway, have not. But what we mean by a culture is a shared language, history, values, and also more external things like dress and cuisine and things like that. But it's important to note that, and this is a mistake that one sees both on the left and the right. The left tends to understand culture as something very superficial. The fact that in Asia they'll use chopsticks as opposed to knife and fork over here, which of course is a part of culture, but it's an extremely superficial part of culture. Of course, culture is something that goes much deeper. If that's how you understand culture in such a superficial way, then of course there should be no problem combining them. Similarly, on the right, it's not as grave a mistake, but it's still a mistake that you hear a lot on the right, where people say that, well, culture is simply a question of holding a certain set of beliefs. For example, if we believe in democracy or in the equality of the sexes and so on, then we share a culture. And again, there is some truth in both of these conceptions, both on the left and on the right, but it's so much more than that. Being a part of a culture isn't just those things. It is also the shared history, for example. This is why you cannot simply say that, okay, I believe in secularism, and therefore I can now live in France and be a Frenchman, for example. It's much more than that. It's a shared language. It's a shared history. It's a shared sense of identity. The idea that we have been here for centuries, for millennia, even, and all of that is a part of culture. So we can't say that it's any one of those things. It's all of those things together. And if we say that, if we isolate one of those aspects, then we haven't fully understood what a culture is. Now, I say that, of course, with a certain caveat. There are certain differences between Europe and the United States in this regard. Obviously, in the United States, we are more of a melting pot. It's a cliche, but of course it's true. I'm an immigrant to the United States myself. So obviously my ancestors have not been on this soil for millennia, not even centuries. But basically, in order to understand a culture, we at least have to understand that it's something that approaches that conception of it. And then in different parts of the world, you can find certain exceptions, and you would have to revise the understanding of it to a certain extent based on the particular circumstances that obtain in that place, in that time and place. But by and large, to understand what a culture is, we have to keep all of these conceptions in mind at the same time.
Excellent. So I think it's important to dwell on it a bit, because you're saying that a culture requires commonality of language and a shared history What was I?
Yeah, I
Right.
think
So
that's fair.
I think mentioning also Wittgenstein, but also the way of approaching language, I think it's also tied to a notion of a way of life within the context that you mentioned, but also it features in several ways because people use the term culture in order to capture all sorts of different things. So, for
Mm,
instance, in ways that you could say, in some cases, the same culture counts as involving a host of cultures, or from another lens, it could just be one, it could just involve a dominant monoculture.
mm,
But I think that, for instance, we could be talking about punk culture, road culture,
correct.
rock and roll culture, all sorts of cultures and groups within a society that practice different ways of life, but also have a common, some shared commonalities. And in virtue of those shared commonalities, they can function as a society. And from a perspective, they can be seen as multicultural, but not necessarily from another perspective. So I think
Mm,
when we're talking about multiculturalism and culture, I think we need to discern between contexts
mhm.
and the civilizational context, the political, the social, the countercultural. Sometimes that sounds like an oxymoron, but I think that we can draw meaning out of it. Because the reason I say this is because a lot of people who reject one form of multiculturalism in the domain of, for instance, the of society at large, they think that automatically every form of multiculturalism may be wrong,
Mm,
and they want to occupy the perspective that everyone has to live in the same way, believe the same things.
mm,
It's just a a culture with that has shared genetics and a shared origin, and it just is incredibly monolithic. And I think that
mm,
this isn't the case historically speaking.
mm,
But on the other hand, there are enough problems for that to render particular forms of multiculturalism incredibly problematic.
mm.
So, would you say that this makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with everything you just said. And that's also why, in the very beginning, I rejected an essentialist understanding of culture, saying that we kind of have to look a little, take a somewhat more complex view of the phenomenon and look at how it plays out in at various times and places. And I especially your point about various types of subcultures, like whatever it was that you said, all these in Germany, of course, they attach the word Kultur to everything, and so that's probably having lived many years in that country, I that resonates a lot with me because everything is a culture in the German language, building culture and train station culture and so on. So that's certainly true. And as I also mentioned, for example, in the United States, obviously the situation is a bit different from Europe. And even within Europe, and of course, this is what the left always loves to point out when they say, "Oh, people have immigrated back and forth over centuries." Of course, again, there is some truth to that, but of course, that doesn't mean that it has been on anything approaching the same level as it is now, or that it justifies the kinds of levels that we see now. And so, yes, there is, of course, part of, if we take a broader view of the West, of course, there is, of course, also an overarching Western culture, which means that immigration within the West from one Western place to another Western place um, is um, is a change of culture, but in a broader sense, it is also a continuation of the same culture. I mean, when one travels, or one can go as a Westerner to another Western country where one has never been before and still recognize lots of things as a Westerner. And so that's also important to keep in mind when it comes to multiculturalism. Maybe this is something we're going to get into more, but the idea that these things can be combined, however, also comes from the fact that a lot of cultural manifestations have been watered down, and they can only be combined because they have been watered down. If a culture remains very strong in its self-confidence, then it is much more difficult to combine it with another culture, or with segments of another culture. So these are all things that have to be taken into consideration when we say, okay, can these things be combined or not? When we say that two different religions, for example, can coexist, it's often because those religions themselves have been watered down and they are not anymore what they used to be. And that applies not just for
Very true.
religions. Yeah, for religions and also for many other manifestations of cultural expression.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.